I just want to look at the biblical evidence of the enmity between the Jews and the Arabs. It sort of starts very small because really it's between two people and just a few people. For example, when Ishmael was born, God said about Ishmael, "This is what you will call him. He will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man and every man's hand against him." And there's only a very small amount of biblical evidence to demonstrate that. It's actually when it's linked up with other Bible prophecies later on that we suddenly realize how powerful this piece of information really is. We're told by the Apostle Paul in Galatians that Ishmael persecuted his brother Isaac. He was 13 years older than Isaac and obviously didn't like the idea of a younger half-brother. Esau and Jacob, you probably remember on the family tree, Esau and Jacob were twins, but Esau hated Jacob. He said in his heart, "I will kill my brother Jacob." And a lot of the enmity that exists between the Jews and the Arab actually spring from these people here. But there's more than that as well. When Israel came out of Egypt, they needed to cross the land of Edom, the place where Esau had gone to with his people, who were now a great people, a mighty people. And they wanted to cross the land. And they said, "Look, we'll come peacefully, we won't cause you any trouble, and we'll pay for everything that we eat on the way. We won't cause any destruction whatever." But Esau said, "No, we're not allowing you. You're not crossing our land." And he came out against them with many men and with a strong hand and caused Israel to go all the way around him. And this is what Ezekiel tells us, gives us a little bit more information about what actually went on in those days. And it's described as an ancient hatred that Esau has had for the Jewish people, or the Arabs have had for the Jewish people. They have shed the blood of the children of Israel by the power of the sword at the time of their calamity. And Esau's grandson, Amalek, God says to Israel, "Remember what he did when you came out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked the sick and the stragglers at the rear, the old people." He said, "Remember what he did, and you will take your revenge on him eventually." And that's in Deuteronomy chapter 25. I think it's you next. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So this conflict between the Arab and the Jew, which stemmed from the forefathers of their nations, as the Bible predicted, would carry on through generations. Now, we've already said that this was a big event when Israel came back to their land. And right back in Deuteronomy, this was predicted that God would gather, in the red at the bottom there, would gather Israel from all the peoples where the Lord had scattered you and would turn them back to their land. And this was accurately fulfilled in 1948. And fulfillment of passages like this should, we believe, make it evident that there's an intimate relationship between God and the Jew. Okay? And that God's word is reliable. So, for the next part of the evening, I'd like us just to focus in on how this tiny, tiny little nation grew against all the odds. And I believe it leaves little choice to accept that through this tiny nation, we can see the hand of God in the world at work. So, on May the 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, he proclaimed to the world that Israel was now a state, fulfilling numerous Bible prophecies. That same day, or that same night rather, 30,000 Arabs invaded Israel. This is known as the War, 1948 to 1949. The odds were massively against this newborn state, this newborn nation, Israel. They were poorly equipped. Many of the Jews had just come out of Europe after facing the Holocaust and persecution. They only had light arms. They had no heavy artillery. They had no air force, no real battle experience. And they ended up fighting 5 Arab nations, 2 guerrilla armies on 3 fronts. We could have the lights down. Just watch this video.
The territory of Palestine has long been fought over. Over the years, the land has been occupied by the ancient Greeks, the Jews, the Romans, the Crusaders, the Muslims, and the Ottomans. The land has gone through good times and bad, been occupied by powerful kingdoms and economically corrupt villages. The land has caused many tensions between cultures, but perhaps the most powerful tension would be between the Jews and the Muslims. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved and handed to Britain and France. The territory of Palestine was taken by Britain and became the British Mandate. When World War II ended and the Holocaust was discovered, the UN decided to give a homeland for the Jews. The Jews in Europe were then encouraged to immigrate to the British Mandate, previously occupied by the Muslims. The Jews that did emigrate to the British Mandate were unhappy, and soon riots broke out, and soon a civil war was started. At its end, the Jewish people signed a Declaration of Independence and became the nation of Israel. The Muslims that had been driven out of the land by the British Mandate were angered by the creation of Israel, and so all of the neighboring Muslim countries declared war. The Islamic nations staged an attack on Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Israel, angered by the attacks, moved to the offensive, moving over into Muslim territory. After several painful battles, the UN offered an armistice agreement. Israel agreed, and the Muslim nations, not wanting any more land to be taken, slowly agreed to the peace agreement. A major result of the war was a shift in population and a new map. The whole map of the Middle East was redrawn, therefore resizing, adding, and removing countries and territories. Muslim countries, angered by Israel's win, forcefully kicked out all Jews from their lands. Israel allowed for Muslims to stay, but many voluntarily fled. The result was millions of refugees and a huge shift in population.
The world thought that the newly founded Jewish nation was heading for disaster. But few in the world realized that there was a truer might behind Israel's forces. By the time the ceasefire was announced on the 7th of January 1949, the world was literally stunned. This is a quote coming from an expert in military affairs. This is John Pimlott. He's a senior lecturer at the Military Academy, and this is from his book, The Middle East Conflicts, which he studied in detail. And he says the Israeli Defense Force, compared to the Arabs, was weak in terms of manpower, lacked modern weapons, and was forced to fight on 3 fronts. It's difficult, in the face of it, to understand the overwhelming success of the Israeli Defense Force in the field, considering the enormous disadvantages under which it entered what the Israelis call, with some justification, the War of Independence. Nobody expected Israel to survive. After an embarrassing defeat for the Muslim Arabs in 1948, hostilities against Israel grew again. This time the Arab nations were determined to deal with Israel once and for all.
The year is 1967. Israel had grown from a nation of refugees into a vibrant new democracy. Where there was once desert, there were now thriving cities and abundant farms. But soon, Israel's very existence would be threatened, with 250,000 Arab troops from 4 countries amassing on her borders. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Arab world's most powerful leader, summed up the goal. Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. The groundwork for this looming conflict was laid more than a decade earlier. In 1956, Jordan controlled the West Bank, and Syria the Golan Heights. Egypt controlled the Sinai Peninsula and used it as a frequent launching point for attacks against Israeli citizens. It blocked Israel's vital shipping route through the Straits of Tiran. In a successful military campaign, Israel took control of the Sinai Peninsula and reopened the straits. In a UN-brokered peace deal, UN forces entered the Sinai and Gaza to create a buffer zone. Israel agreed to withdraw, despite lack of commitments from Egypt to prevent terrorist infiltration. While President Eisenhower supported the Israeli withdrawal, he also pledged U.S. support of Israel's right to free passage through the straits. But the fragile peace was soon broken.
This is Kol Yisrael, the voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. Radio Cairo announced this morning that the Egyptian fleet had prevented the passage of a tanker through the Tiran Straits.
This time, Nasser's aggression goes further. He moves his troops into positions along the Israeli border. Fanning Arab hostility toward Israel, he encourages Jordan, Syria, and Iraq to do the same. Radio Cairo broadcasts Nasser's threats. We will operate as one army fighting a single battle. We accept no kind of coexistence with Israel. The Arab nation has decided to cleanse Palestine of your presence. Soon, hundreds of thousands of Arab soldiers, vastly outnumbering Israel's defense forces, surround the 19-year-old nation. In a further act of hostility, Nasser demands that UN troops withdraw their buffer from the Sinai and Gaza. And they do.
This is Kol Yisrael, the voice of Israel, broadcasting from Jerusalem. President Johnson convenes the United States Cabinet on the Middle East situation.
The United States considers the Gulf to be an international waterway and feels that a blockade of Israel shipping is illegal and potentially disastrous to the cause of peace.
Fearing for their survival, Israeli citizens prepare for war, even as their leaders press for peace.
Diplomatic activity has stepped up to full steam ahead. Foreign Minister Abba Eban sets out for world capitals.
But diplomatic efforts fail. With Arab troops on the march along every border, Israel makes a preemptive strike in the Sinai. In just 6 days, Israel wipes out Egyptian air and ground forces and retakes the Sinai Peninsula. It captures the strategic high ground of the Golan Heights, which had been used by Syria to attack Israeli civilians for years. Pushing back Jordanian troops, Israeli forces reunified Jerusalem, giving Jews the first chance in 19 years to visit and pray at the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. Despite the continued antagonistic posture of its neighbors, Israel reaches out for peace. On June 19, 1967, the Israeli cabinet votes to exchange all the territory it had won from Egypt and Syria in return for signed peace treaties, recognizing Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. President Johnson warns that without such treaties, a return of land would once again be a mistake.
This is not a prescription for peace, but for renewed hostilities.
Israel has continued to seek peace with all her neighbors, signing peace agreements with both Egypt and Jordan, and has attempted numerous times to come to an agreement with the Palestinian leadership. Today, Israel continues to strive for peace.
Okay, so the 1967 war. Another war where Israel were dramatically outnumbered by its enemies. There we have two maps. The map before, and in just 6 days, we can see on the second map how much land Israel had taken to prevent their enemies destroying them. Defeated again, humiliated, deprived of more than 65,000 square kilometers of territory, the Arabs retreated, and many of them dedicated themselves to recovery and revenge. So determined were some of the Arabs that the 1967 war was soon followed by yet another all-out attack to get rid of Israel. That was the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The Yom Kippur is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Egypt and Syria opened another coordinated surprise attack, hoping that they would catch them off guard because a lot of the nation would have been worshipping and involved in festivities at the time. The equivalent of the total of all NATO forces that are currently in Europe attacked Israel. 9 Arab states this time, 4 non-Muslim Eastern nations, actively aided by Egyptian and Syrian war efforts. So, just to recap, 1973 we had the Yom Kippur War on the Jewish holy day. Egypt and Syria, both from the south and the north, opened another coordinated surprise attack against Israel. The equivalent of NATO forces were mobilized on Israel's borders. And this time the Arabs were confident that they could finish the job of getting rid of Israel. Okay, if we focus on then the north, the invasion on the north, or the attack on the north of the land of Israel, where the Golan Heights are. This is an area of land that was in control of Syria, mountainous area overlooking Israel, a very strategic position, military-wise. Israel had 180 tanks facing 1,400 Syrian tanks, also facing 18,000 Iraqi men, several hundred Iraqi tanks, Iraqi aircraft mix, 3,000 Syrian troops, 2,500 Moroccans, and Lebanon also in the north allowed Palestinian terrorists to start shelling civilians as well. Jordan joined in with their best brigades, 40th and 60th Armoured Brigades, and on top of that also artillery batteries. We come to the south of Israel, down by the Suez Canal, which is right at the bottom of that map. It's a waterway, that very important waterway that allows shipping into Israel. The odds against them were even worse. 500 Israelis attacked by 80,000 Egyptians. Libya sent fighters, Algeria sent fighter aircraft, bombers. The list just goes on. Algerian Armoured Brigade, 150 tanks. Tunisia sent soldiers to join in. Sudanese. And again, Palestinians fought the southern front with the Egyptians and the Kuwaitis. Things were not looking good, were they? And yet, despite all of the odds against them again and again and again, Israel survived. And not only survived, they conquered. And very nearly, without the intervention of the United Nations, completely wiped out the Egyptian army. Okay, despite then all these repeated attacks from the Arabs against the Jews, the descendants of Esau and Ishmael, despite the odds of survival being massively against the Jews, they survived. And as a fledgling democracy with the support of the West, not only did they survive, they prospered greatly. And now, current day, Israel have one of the best militaries in the world. The Arabs, and particularly the Palestinians, now realised after these wars that an all-out attack on Israel wouldn't work. So they embarked on a new era, which was led by the PLO, and you might recognise this face, some of you, Yasser Arafat, no longer with us, but he was the creator of the PLO. They embarked on a new three-phase strategy for Israel's destruction. The organisation was called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organisation. As we said, Yasser Arafat was its leader. And after the Six-Day War, he claimed that he was the sole representative of the Palestinian people, the people that were the immediate neighbours of Israel. He vowed to reclaim their land eventually and destroy the state of Israel, like many of the Arab nations had tried to do, but he was going to do it a different way. An all-out attack would not work, or wouldn't seem to work for some reason, so he used terrorism and suicide bombers.